Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our International Symposium. Our keynote speaker today is Jeremy. Jeremy, say your name again.
Konyndyk.
Konyndyk. Jeremy Konyndyk. Jeremy is the president of Refugees International. And this session is entitled The End of an Era. And that's with the question mark, not a statement. It's the end of an era, rethinking aid, partnership, and influence beyond USAID.
Yeah.
Before we get into the session, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes for our attendees today. First of all, attendees, you can enable the closed captioning function using the toolbar at the bottom of your screens if you need that. Also, throughout the presentation today, you can be submitting questions as they come to you via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We don't have the chat enabled, so don't try to put questions there. Put them in using the Q&A button. Also, when this session is completed, you will immediately get a pop-up survey to link to give us feedback on the session, and we would appreciate you filling that out as well. And finally, just to let everyone know that we are recording all of our sessions for the International Symposium, and those recordings will be available on our website in a couple of weeks. So if you'd like to go back and refresh your memory, or you couldn't see all of it, or you want someone else to watch that wasn't able to be here, look for those recordings. So let me give a fuller introduction of our speaker. So as I said, Jeremy is the president of Refugees International. He is a committed humanitarian advocate and a seasoned emergency operator. And he has served in senior appointments in 2 U.S. administrations and in a range of U.S. and overseas NGO leadership positions. So prior to joining Refugees International, Jeremy served in the Biden administration as USAID's lead official for COVID-19. He also served on the Biden-Harris transition teams for the Department of State and Health and Human Services. From 2013 to 17, Jeremy served in the Obama administration as the director of USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, where he led the U.S. government's response to international disasters. He managed a large global team with annual resources of more than $1.4 billion. He responded to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, the 2016 Ethiopia drought, the conflict in northern Nigeria, the Nepal earthquake, the Iraq crisis, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, resurgent conflicts in South Sudan, and the war in Syria, among other crises. And we thought we were having a bad day. Jeremy, it's amazing. He also led the agency's preparations for the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit. Between his various administration appointments, Jeremy worked from 2017 to 2020 as a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, focusing on humanitarian response and pandemic preparedness research. He developed and led CGD's Rethinking Humanitarian Reform initiative, exploring how the humanitarian system could meaningfully shift power and influence toward crisis-affected populations, and why it has traditionally failed in its commitments to do so. Jeremy has worked extensively in the humanitarian NGO sector, serving as a country director in West Africa and East Africa with the American Refugee Committee, and as a policy director in Washington, D.C. with the Mercy Corps. Began his career in the Balkans, working on response to the 1999 war in Kosovo. He also worked with the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. He is currently a member of the World Health Organization's high-level Independent Oversight and Advisory Committee, which oversees the agency's health emergencies programs and advises the WHO Director General. So quite a long list of accomplishments. We are very fortunate to have Jeremy share his ideas with us on the topic of how to think about aid and partnerships in a post-USAID world. So Jeremy, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. And it's a real privilege to talk to all of you today. I've been looking through the names in the Zoom box here and see some familiar names in there from various parts of my career. So that's fun. And hello to I'm not going to name everybody, but you know who you are, and it's really good to see you guys in the chat. Um, so, uh, you've gotten a rundown of my bio there. Let me just say a little bit too about my organization, Refugees International. Um, we are uh, somewhat uniquely in the humanitarian landscape a fully independent advocacy organization. So fully independent in the sense that we take no government funding, we take no UN funding, and advocacy in the sense that we don't do field service delivery programs. We focus solely on advocacy and policy work. And while we do have a lot of partners overseas that we work with in advancing those advocacy objectives, we're not doing that as an organization that maintains, a permanent field program somewhere or something like that. And so we are really built from the ground up to be a fully independent organization, both in terms of our organizational structure and in terms of our financial model. And that's probably never been more important than it has been over the past year. Um, we're going to talk today about USAID and its past and its and the future of foreign aid without it. Um, One of the dynamics we've seen this year is it was very, very difficult for many organizations in our space to be able to speak out as openly as they wished because they were all USAID funding recipients. And so we are built not to face that kind of trade-off, and it's one of the reasons why we have been able to be as vocal as we've been over the past year about the damage being done by the destruction of USAID. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of four big areas or four big questions. First, why did we have USAID in the first place? What was its purpose? How did it come about? Why did we have it? How did it serve the American national interest? Um, Second, what happened to it? What actually went down last year that took down the agency? Third, what's the fallout that we're seeing from that? And I'll talk through some of the damage that my organization has documented and also damage that's being documented by others. And finally, where do we go from here? What is the future? What does the future look like without, we're getting a sense of what the present looks like without USAID. What do we think the future looks like without USAID? And what should we hope to build if there's an opportunity to build something back in the future? So let's first go back in time a little bit to why we even had USAID in the first place. So USAID was founded in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy, and I think I always find it helpful to look back at his words for why he founded USAID and what ethos he laid out as the founding case for USAID. And when he proposed the establishment of USAID, very interestingly, he made the moral case for aid central to USAID's raison d'etre. So uh, uh, he said, and this is a quote, "There's no escaping our obligations. Our moral obligations as a wise leader and good neighbor in the interdependent community of free nations. Our economic obligations as the wealthiest people in a world of many poor people, and our political obligations as the single largest counter to the adversaries of freedom. To fail to meet those obligations now would be disastrous and in the long run more expensive." I find that really powerful because he is talking about the convergence of our values and our interests. He says that if we fail to act in line with our values, if we fail to act with generosity, if we fail to promote and defend freedom in the world, ultimately that is more expensive for us. That hurts our interests if we do not live our values. And he goes on to say, um, widespread poverty and chaos would lead to collapse. Thus, our own security would be endangered and our own prosperity imperiled. A program of assistance must continue because the nation's interest and the cause of political freedom require it. And that ethos, that merger of our interests and our values, or that convergence of our interests and our values, really was central to how USAID operated in the 60 plus years of its existence. Um, Kennedy's insight drew on some of the lessons of the Marshall Plan, which had happened about a decade earlier. And under the Marshall Plan, you're all probably familiar with this, but the U.S. spent a massive amount of money to help Europe rebuild. And in that act of goodwill, it also laid the foundation for Cold War security alliances that helped to protect the United States for decades to come. And that again, that convergence of values and interests, you can see that again and again in the many achievements of U.S. aid and of U.S. foreign aid engagement in the decades that followed. Huge progress, huge wins in things like the Green Revolution. So in U.S. aid's first decade, the Green Revolution, which invested in increasing agricultural yields in lower income countries, helped it really revolutionized agriculture and agricultural production in ways that helped to feed hundreds of millions more people around the world and stabilize countries that had chronically struggled with famine. In the 1970s, USAID investments helped to fully eradicate smallpox. That remains one of the signature global health achievements in human history, the full eradication of what had previously been an incredible scourge that had, killed countless people throughout history, damaged lives, debilitated children, now gone. We don't even think about smallpox anymore. And USAID and the role that USAID played had a huge part in that. Other global health investments like the PEPFAR program, which was launched by George W. Bush in 2003, helped to turn what was at that point an overwhelming outbreak, really almost pandemic level outbreak of HIV that was spreading through much of the world and particularly devastating much of sub-Saharan Africa. It helped to reverse that. And as of a few years ago, bring HIV transmission nearly under epidemic control, which is, something that words that would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. And again, it is the PEPFAR program as well as other U.S. Leadership on global health investments that helped that enabled that to happen. U.S. global health investments, along with in partnership with others in the world, helped to drive down global child mortality by 60% from 1990 to 2015. And U.S. humanitarian response over the years to earthquakes and hurricanes and wars and famines and other natural disasters and unnatural disasters has saved countless millions of lives over the years. These kinds of achievements and successful initiatives were not just benevolent gestures of solidarity, they were also important strategic investments. They laid the groundwork for long-term American security and prosperity. They reduced health threats that could have harmed Americans. They stabilized strategically important regions. They advanced shared economic prosperity. And successive American administrations had traditionally understood that, had understood that solving global problems while projecting and demonstrating American goodwill was a uniquely important form of American global soft power and global influence. Um, it also could advance hard interests and global hard power. It could mitigate transnational threats. It could protect us from things like pandemics. Um, and and so that really up until even through the first Trump administration, that was understood, and it was only over the past year that that has been now abandoned. And I share that history because I think it's important then to understand that legacy, understand the legacy that is now being destroyed as we look next to what happened to USA last year. So let's look back at how that happened. Um, I think it's helpful to start just before the inauguration in December 2024. So in December of that year, a journalist reached out to me privately to ask what I thought of a man named Pete Morocco. And Pete Morocco was rumored to be under consideration for a senior foreign aid position in the second Trump administration. Um, it's worth talking about Morocco a bit because while a lot of the public attention has focused understandably on the role of Elon Musk, Morocco's role has kind of flown under the radar more. I got a sinking feeling when I heard that name from the journalist. He had been a notoriously difficult character in the first Trump administration. He had been pushed out of no fewer than four different jobs in the first Trump administration. the final position he held was at USAID. And within a few weeks of arriving at the agency during the final year of that term, he proved so toxic within the agency that even the other Trump-appointed senior officials put him in the freezer, put him on administrative leave for the rest of the year, and and that left him seemingly with kind of an axe to grind against the agency. And so when he came back in early last year, he was named to a senior budget role at the State Department, traditionally a kind of quiet position, behind the scenes position that focused on coordinating the foreign aid budget across different parts of the government. But Morocco was able to weaponize that perch to initiate an assault on USAID. And so he helped to produce a White House executive order, presidential executive order, initially freezing all new foreign aid grant making. He then, at the State Department, sent an additional cable, got what's called an ALDAC, a guidance to all posts around the world that didn't just freeze new grant making, it actually instructed the total suspension of all ongoing foreign aid activities everywhere in the world. He also then began initiating a purge of senior USAID career personnel. And that, all of that was very damaging in its own right, as you can imagine. But I think on its own, I don't think that that would have achieved the total destruction of USAID. What made that possible was then when Elon Musk and Doge entered the equation. And so um, the combination of Morocco's own vendetta and his, to give him his due, his fairly sophisticated understanding of the pressure points within the architecture, as well as Elon Musk's unchecked influence in those early months of the administration, was overwhelming. And so, with Morocco operating behind the scenes, knowing which systems to target and which personnel to target, and Elon Musk's Twitter feed spewing out a megaphone of disinformation, seeking to discredit USAID and mainlining that directly to President Trump, um, it 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 was enough to take down the agency. And I think it's worth dwelling on this for a moment, just understanding how that happened. Uh, the I can't do full justice here to the the entire breadth of the bad faith propaganda campaign. But I think a few examples really capture it. And none of this is to say USAID was a perfect agency. It certainly wasn't. And I'll say more a bit later in my remarks about both the shortcomings that USAID had and what, I would hope we could rebuild at some point in the future and why that would need to be different. Um, but none of those valid critiques of USAID, of which there are many, were what drove the takedown of the agency. Instead, it was things like a claim at one point in February of last year that Doge had stopped a $50 million payment for condoms going to Gaza. That was stated by Elon Musk. It was repeated by the White House press secretary and then later repeated by President Trump himself. As someone who's worked on public health programs and reproductive health programs, my immediate reaction when I heard that figure was, I wonder how many condoms that would buy. And USAID would get very good rates on condoms. They bought them and promoted them through global health programs and reproductive health programs all over the world. And so they got a pretty sizable bulk discount. So I called up a friend of mine at one of the organizations that worked on those programs, and I said, how many condoms could you buy for $50 million? And he said somewhere between 1 to 1.2 billion with a B, billion condoms. There's no world in which anyone ever was going to send a billion condoms to Gaza. Uh, and it was farcical on its face, but that did not stop it being repeated by every official organ of the United States government up to and including the president. And it was, of course, wrong. And they later admitted it was wrong. But by the time they admitted it was wrong, it had had its desired effect. It had done the damage to USAID's credibility that they were hoping to do. Another example of this, the White House put out a fact sheet, a so-called fact sheet at one point, which listed a number of programs that they framed as justifying why USAID was a rogue radical agency and needed to be destroyed. Two of the programs that got the most attention on that list were what the White House termed a transgender opera in Colombia, $47,000, and what it termed a transgender comic book in Peru for $32,000. Now, leave aside that 47 and $32,000 are a fraction of a pittance of a fraction of the tens of billions of dollars in the foreign aid budget. Even leave aside the validity of those programs, which were not actually what the White House characterized them as. Leave all that aside. Neither of those were USAID programs. They were both State Department programs. They had been funded through State Department funds, through ambassadors, had nothing to do with USAID. So, again, the justifications being used to destroy the agency did not actually relate to what the agency was in fact doing. One other justification used by in this case Elon Musk was with respect to Ebola. And at one point there were reports that there was an Ebola outbreak ongoing in Uganda while this was all happening. And Musk admitted that they had actually put that team on hold that was working on the Ebola response, but he claimed that they had accidentally canceled them very briefly, but then immediately restored them with no interruption. In reality, the New York Times reported that several of those grants were canceled within hours of Musk making that statement. And that had disrupted core response activities like the procurement and supply of personal protective equipment for the health workers who were treating the Ebola cases, and even disrupted traveler screening for Ebola at Uganda's main airport. So there was, nothing factual, nothing reality based about this assault on USAID. And the crazy thing is that despite that, it worked. It worked. The disinformation campaign was effective and successful. And I think it's important to spend a little time revisiting those kinds of claims because they were so central to the rationale for destroying USAID and trying to discredit foreign aid more generally. The president and the White House repeated those falsehoods, and President Trump was clearly persuaded by them, which is really striking too. He had no particular problem with USAID in his first administration, and in fact, his daughter Ivanka was a supporter and a champion of a lot of what USAID did, particularly around women's programming. Um, but in this term, it was no longer Ivanka that was talking to the president about this. It was Elon, and we saw a sharp pivot as a result. And even Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, who certainly knew better and who, as a senator, had been a fan and a champion of USAID, really abruptly changed his tune and came out against the agency after this campaign of falsehoods and started talking about USAID as a rogue agency, started slandering its staff as a bunch of insubordinate radicals. And so, the net outcome of that campaign, that online disinformation campaign, was the total destruction of the agency. And by March of last year, Secretary Rubio was announcing that 80% of USAID's grants and contracts were being canceled. They proceeded to fire the entire staff of the agency, to close all the overseas missions. And by the middle of the year, the agency was effectively gone. And just a small handful of its grants and contracts and a small handful of its personnel, just a few hundred people out of a 15,000 or so person agency, were taken over to the State Department, and the rest was gone. And there's a huge fallout to that. So let's turn next to what that fallout looks like. Um, Ultimately, that campaign of online disinformation had a very real impact in the offline world. The elimination of USAID and the closure of its programs is already beginning to have devastating effects that are becoming visible and apparent. Uh, Secretary Rubio has tried repeatedly, as has Elon Musk, to claim that no one has died as a result of these cuts, but that claim collapses under the most minimal of scrutiny. Um, we and other organizations and a lot of news outlets and journalists have been documenting this, and just to give a few examples now of what the harm is beginning to look like. Uh, the outlet ProPublica, which has done just tremendous reporting on this throughout last year, reported from South Sudan that it was experiencing the largest cholera outbreak in its history, um, in large measure because many of the programs that had prevented cholera from spreading in the past were now gone because of the U.S. aid cuts. So, for those of you who don't know cholera very well, that's a fortunate thing for you. But cholera spreads when you have human feces contaminating people's drinking water. So there is a sanitation element to that. You need to make sure that drinking water sources are separate from the sanitation system or where people are defecating. There is a preparedness element in that. You need to train people so that they know to boil their water, they know what the risks are. There is a treatment and a medical health element to that. There is an oral cholera vaccine that's very effective, but you have to roll it out. You have to have access to it. And there's a treatment element in that if you can identify a case of cholera, it is an eminently treatable situation. You just need to get somebody back on clean water and get them rehydrated and provide supportive health care to help in their recovery. And if you do all that, it is generally death is generally avoidable or preventable. But if you don't do those things, it is an absolute buzzsaw of a disease. It is a terrifying and horrible disease that can be very hard to stop. And we've seen that over the years that when cholera is allowed to get out of control, it's extremely deadly. And that is what's happening now in South Sudan. So ProPublica, as of the time of their reporting, cited an official death toll of 1,600 people, but also noted that is a wild undercount. Many of the clinics that would have been counting the dead are closed. And so people are dying quietly and silently. They interviewed several people in that piece who had lost family members to cholera, people who were not on the official count. So it's likely just in that instance that that is several thousand people dead who would not have died if those programs had remained in place. Nick Kristof at the New York Times has done incredibly powerful and really just jarring reporting on some of the damage of these cuts. He tells the story of one young refugee girl in Uganda who contracted malaria because her family couldn't afford a bed net. And the free bed nets were no longer available because of the aid cuts. Then wasn't immediately able to get treatment because the clinic that would have provided those services had lost funding. Could not get an ambulance ride to another clinic because the ambulance service had also lost funding. And by the time she was able to seek treatment, died. Um, an entirely preventable death and reflective of multiple layers of breakdown as a result of the aid cuts. My former colleague at USAID, Atul Gawande, has put together a really powerful short film that's available on YouTube and on the New Yorker's website that tells another such story from a refugee camp in Kenya of a young girl who died of severe malnutrition, effectively because her mother, who was quite impoverished in that camp, even by the context of the camp, was very badly off, had to choose between whether she looked after her children, her other older children um, who were less malnourished, or brought her youngest daughter in for malnutrition treatment, and couldn't do both. Could not be with her child receiving malnutrition treatment while continuing to look after her other kids, and had to make a wrenching choice. So that's called Rovina's Choice, named the Rovina was the mother. I mean, it's a really hard movie to watch, but I think a very important one because again, it shows the horrific choices that people are now forced to make in crisis settings as a result of the aid cuts. And that's all reflective of the fact that 25 million fewer people received humanitarian aid last year than received it in 2024. Um, Another such example, sticking with South Sudan, or going back rather to South Sudan, I spoke with a colleague just this week at another organization who said that one of their program sites had recently seen several children, 7 children rather, die of malnutrition after nutrition services in the area had been disrupted by the cuts. So, we are seeing in country after country cases of people, and particularly vulnerable children, dying today as a result of these aid cuts. So that kind of micro level damage is very visible, or kind of ground level damage is very visible. If you zoom up to more of a macro level, a 30,000 foot level, there are a number of analyses that have been published that put the likely death toll for just the past year in the hundreds of thousands and project a potential death toll if worst case scenarios play out that could be well into the millions over the next few years. Some studies even cite as high as 9 to 14 million by 2030 could lose their lives as a result of these aid cuts. At Refugees International, my team just put out a new paper summarizing some of the other impacts that we're seeing, and a couple that I'll just cite here. There have been huge impacts on reduction of healthcare and reduction of food and hunger services. The more than 2,000 health clinics have closed fully in crisis settings around the world, and more than 3,000 have had to curtail services. And that is affecting health services for 53 million people. We saw this, for example, in Syria earlier this or last year. We sent a team to Syria after the fall of the government and the end of the war, and found that particularly in some of the opposition-held areas, much of the health services, because those had been areas beyond state control, were aid supported, and those were collapsing as a result of the aid cuts, just at the moment when people should have been able to begin coming home. Uh, Food aid spending is also down by about 40% last year relative to the year before, and that has led the UN to sharply reduce rations in many places around the world. They have suspended food aid. They suspended food aid last year for 1 million refugees in Uganda. They sharply reduced food rations in the camps in Kenya, leading to major protests. And you see instances of that in countries all over the world. Our analysis also found very disproportionate effects on women and girls. As we know, and I'm sure if you're watching this, you know well that women and girls tend to face disproportionate harm from any sort of shortfall in a crisis setting. That's particularly acute in Afghanistan. So we put out a report last month that looked at how women and girls in Afghanistan are navigating the aid cuts. That's a particularly extreme case because the US didn't just curtail programming, it fully barred any assistance to Afghanistan. And so what that has meant in practice is that many services for women and girls, which the Taliban did not support but would tolerate if other donors were funding them, those have collapsed. So healthcare services specific to women and girls, some education services for women and girls, other protection services, support for gender-based violence, things like this. All of those are now eroding or collapsing because of the US aid cuts. And what that has done, and what we found in some of our analysis, was that is in effect making the Taliban's job of imposing gender apartheid on Afghanistan that much easier because they don't even have to shut these services down. The US is doing it for them by pulling funding. Uh, the last thing, and something that I think is really, really important to understand and to keep an eye on over the next few years, is we are seeing a global uptick in what humanitarians call negative coping strategies. That is a very jargony way of saying when people are in a situation of extreme deprivation, they will adopt survival strategies that are damaging and unsustainable. We often see this kind of thing in the run up to a famine. So before a famine, in a famine, in a food crisis, people don't immediately starve the moment the food crisis starts. They make adjustments. They may begin selling some of their belongings. They may begin selling, or rather, they may begin consuming some of their seed stocks so that they can't plant the next year. They may pull their kids out of school to save on the school fees. They may, in some extreme cases, begin selling sex. They may begin skipping meals. They may begin eating less nutritious foods that compromise their nutritional health. And what kind of ties all of those things together is those are not sustainable strategies. Those are strategies that get you through, that enable you to survive a short-term shock. But if they are sustained over time, they are very, very damaging. And ultimately, if you have to sustain those negative coping strategies for long enough, that is when mortality begins to rise. Um, we are seeing that pattern in a lot of ways in many countries around the world now, in areas where a population used to be able to rely on U.S. assistance, the withdrawal of that assistance is forcing people into negative coping strategies. And so it's a little bit like um, a global pre-famine period. And the shock in this case is not a famine or a food shock. The shock is the withdrawal of U.S. aid. And so, we have seen things like market increases in child marriage and child labor in refugee camps in Bangladesh, the collapse of informal credit systems in refugee camps in Kenya, um, refugees and others who rely on food assistance often depend heavily on informal credit because that is how you borrow from month to month to meet your food needs. Those informal credit systems have collapsed because of the reduction in food aid. And that is forcing families to adopt more harmful coping strategies, including things like selling off their assets. We've seen women in Afghanistan reducing food consumption to prioritize food for men and other family members, and also reports from the UN that forced marriage and transactional sex are on the rise in Afghanistan as well. As a result, both of the pullback of the gender programming and the total elimination of US food aid programming there. So it's a very, very bad scene in the humanitarian sector. It's also pretty bad outside the humanitarian sector. So if you look at the health sector, um, there are deals that the U.S. has been trying to negotiate with other countries to stop funding through NGOs and development contractors, and instead channel that money directly to national governments. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Um, But a number of countries are looking at the terms that the US is offering, and particularly some of the extractive data sharing requirements and balking at those deals. So South Africa was blacklisted by the US to begin with, wasn't even under consideration, so they're already out. That had been one of the largest US HIV programs in the world, and of course, still has a very large HIV positive population. U.S. support to South Africa is completely withdrawn. But countries like Kenya, Zambia, and Zimbabwe have all signaled to the U.S. that they can't accept the terms of these deals. Just to give you a flavor of that, in exchange for a few years of government to government health programming, the U.S. is demanding 25 years worth of sharing of guaranteed data sharing of sensitive national health data from those governments. And governments are rightly looking at that and kind of raising an eyebrow at those terms. Um, in the education sector, some of the cuts to U.S. education programming could result in 6 million fewer kids in school this year. And the U.S. withdrawal from WHO and the full cutoff of financial support to WHO, it's a really interesting example of how this actually, in damaging the world, we're also damaging our own national interest. So there was a report in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago that the US government is now trying to reverse engineer some of the global health systems and the global health security systems that it used to be able to access through WHO. Things like outbreak preparedness and response, global disease surveillance, laboratory diagnostics, um, and other services that WHO provides to its member states. Uh, and the budget for doing that was reported to be projected at $2 billion a year, which is about triple what the US used to contribute to WHO for everything that WHO did, including that and a lot of other things. So it's actually dramatically more expensive to the US government to try to protect itself in an America first, kind of America alone way rather than just collaborating with the rest of the world through a multilateral body like WHO. Um, so there's a lot of damage becoming visible, and I think this is just, it's still early days. It will likely compound to get worse if this is not reversed in the coming years. But that's kind of the fallout that we're seeing now. Uh, and a new model is emerging, and the model that I think is emerging that we're seeing from the Trump administration is quite a departure from the vision that John F. Kennedy laid out when he founded USAID. Um, so let's turn to that. Let's talk about that a little bit. The new model that's coming into focus is one that often quite explicitly sets aside U.S. values and only talks about U.S. interests. And it's far more explicitly transactional and extractive. Um, and that has some pedigree. During his first term, President Trump would complain about the traditional aid model, and said at one in one of his speeches to the UN General Assembly at one point said that the U.S. was the quote world's largest giver of foreign aid, but few give anything to us. So a very transactional message there. Foreign aid is not for the betterment of others, but foreign aid is a transactional thing that people should give something back to us in exchange for that aid. Secretary Rubio has talked at times of using aid to press countries to vote with us at the UN and to cut off aid to them if they do not. Um, and one example of this newly transactional approach is what I was mentioning earlier, that on global health, rather than working through the network of NGOs and development contractors or so-called Beltway bandits that traditionally ran a lot of the health programming, the US is now seeking to negotiate government to government funding arrangements to fund health response through national health systems. And look, there's actually a lot good that can be said for that. I think if you talk to health professionals and global health professionals over the years, they would tell you they would love to see more government to government or so-called G to G spending and investment on health. And they see the value of investing in national health systems and not just through the parallel services provided by American NGOs and contractors. But they would also tell you that there are reasons why that architecture exists, and the that national health systems can't always absorb that money, can't always account for it, and that is complicated to work through and with national governments. One of the complications is that the US is putting some very explicit policy conditionality on these arrangements and demanding sweeping access to the sensitive internal data from national health systems for a 25-year period. And a lot of countries are balking at that. So Kenya's government had initially agreed to that deal, and then it was challenged in their court system, and their court struck down the deal on the basis of that arrangement. Zambia and Zimbabwe have both. It didn't even reach the courts there. Both of those governments looked at those terms and were not comfortable with those terms, and felt that those were extractive. And the part of the backdrop here is that one of the things that the US government wants those countries to commit to share is data that can be used, or information and analysis that can be used in generating vaccines and countermeasures and diagnostic tests and things like that. So when you have a novel disease emerge somewhere, you need that underlying data to be shared by the country so that researchers around the world can rapidly generate countermeasures. And the countries um, that are being asked for this are reasonably saying, okay, so if we share that data with you so that you can make countermeasures to protect your population, are you going to share those with us? And there's not a commitment to that. The US is not committing to that in these deals. So it's a very one-way arrangement. We give you aid for your health system, and you give us this information, which we may or may not share the benefits of with you. It's pretty understandable why countries don't want to take a deal on those terms. And and so what you see in instances like this is kind of an abandonment of the pretense, or of any pretense that American aid should reflect or advance our values. And um, in that vein, what we have also seen over the past year is a near total abandonment of U.S. programming that would seek to uphold human rights, or to promote good governance and democracy. And in fact, Secretary Rubio has specifically scoffed at the idea that we should use aid to quote lecture countries about ideology, and he has shut down virtually all of the programs that promoted human rights and promoted democracy around the world. And so what that leaves us with, ironically, is something that looks much closer to a Chinese aid model than an American one. China's aid model is much more explicitly extractive, much more explicitly transactional. Traditionally, the US model has not been that. It has been one of, albeit imperfect partnership, but partnership rather than extraction. And part of the way that the US would seek to distinguish itself and distinguish its partnership from China was offering a different model, offering a different form of partnership to countries. I think if we are putting countries in a position now of either taking our extractive deal or China's extractive deal, that puts us on much worse terms. Um, and that undermines really a core comparative advantage of our development approach and of our broader approach to foreign affairs. It moves us away from one in which we are working with countries to build long-term relationships as a partner. The other big risk or another big risk to this kind of a model is just it's likely to generate a lot more waste, fraud, and abuse. Uh, our own track record historically, when we have decoupled foreign aid from a grounding in our values, which we did in a pretty pronounced way in some of the programming in post-war Iraq and Afghanistan, where we tied some of our aid programming very explicitly to narrow military and security objectives, is that it produced a lot of stupid and boondoggle projects. Um, Projects that did very little to actually meaningfully stabilize either of those countries or to advance long-term U.S. interests there, but did generate years worth of investigative fodder for the Special Inspector General for Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of really bad stories of roads that never completed, roads that were never completed, of um, clinics and schools that were built and then sat empty, or other investments that could not be accounted for. And we're already seeing some early signs of that kind of waste. In one truly insane case, the State Department last year waived 9 different federal procurement requirements uh, and circumvented its normal humanitarian organization partners in order to give $30 million to something called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was a brand new entity created by some American and Israeli business people, which then began recruiting its personnel from, and it sounds like I'm making this up, and I am genuinely not making this up, began recruiting its personnel from an Islamophobic American motorcycle gang. And when I first heard that reported last year, I did not believe it because it seemed so outlandish, but the BBC went and got the goods and confirmed that. And in fact, they were sending American motorcycle gang members to operate these distribution sites in Gaza. And not surprisingly, those sites were a disaster, an absolute disaster. And conservatively, hundreds and more likely thousands of Palestinians were killed as they sought to seek aid from those sites because they were so dangerous. Killed by the Israelis, generally the Israeli military, not by the motorcycle gang, but part of an overall setup that was just extraordinarily unsafe, and supported by $30 million of U.S. government funding. In another case last year, the State Department diverted $7.5 million of what should have been refugee funding to the notoriously corrupt government of Equatorial Guinea in a deal that was brokered in part with the president's son, the vice president of the country, who was personally himself so corrupt that for years he was banned from even traveling to the United States until the Trump administration lifted that ban last year. But they gave $7.5 million to that government in exchange for it agreeing to accept deportations of people who were not its own citizens. These are the sort of boondoggles and waste that we're beginning to see, and I suspect they're just the tip of the iceberg of what we will see over the next few years. So, um, obviously, I have a lot of criticisms of that model, but it raises a natural question. So, where should we go from here? And let me say a few words on that before I wrap up. I don't think we should simply restore USAID as it was before. It was not a perfect agency, and it didn't need or deserve to be put through the wood chipper by Elon Musk, but it had a lot of areas that needed reform and improvement. And over its many decades, it had grown increasingly bureaucratic. It had accumulated not always through its own choosing, but had accumulated decades of congressional oversight requirements and legislative directives that had built up like barnacles on the hull of a ship, and like barnacles on the hull of a ship, had made U.S. aid slower and less nimble and less effective than the country needed it to be. It also fell victim, as a lot of the US government does, to an institutional culture that is oriented around procurement rather than partnership. And I don't have enough time to fully go into that now, but please read Jen Palka's book, Recoding America, on this. She captures it really well. The basic idea being what we ask a lot of our civil servants to do in our government is navigate the bureaucratic sludge of our procurement process rather than focus on how best to deliver impact and results for their government and their country. And USAID fell victim to that along with a lot of federal agencies. So um, I do fervently believe that we should reestablish a U.S. development agency, but we should also reimagine it for the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. And I think that means um, going back to the fundamental idea that Kennedy had, which is that this should be a convergence of our interests and our values. So, what values and what interests? I think we need to focus on on some five core values that have a lot of support from the broad public. The first is saving lives. The American people expect their government to lead benevolently in the world, to respond to earthquakes, to fight famines, to support refugees, to fight disease outbreaks, to vaccinate children, all of these things that are very directly and meaningfully life-saving. Second, um, everywhere I go, and anytime I'm talking to refugees in camps around the world, one of the things that they most want is the right to work. They want jobs, they want economic opportunity, they want safety, of course, but they also want self-sufficiency. They don't want to be reliant. They want to be able to rely on themselves. They want self-reliance. And I think that speaks to what should be our second value, which is advancing human potential and expanding prosperity. If people want access to work, they want to be able to support themselves, they want economic opportunity. And that's a really core value that should animate our foreign assistance. The third is upholding rights and freedoms. We should be, as we have tried to do historically and imperfectly, but importantly through the history of our own country, we should be helping citizens around the world to flourish by building free societies that respect and uphold people's fundamental rights. And very related to that is transparency and anti-corruption, which I would propose as a fourth value. I think we're going to need some of that after a few years of an extractive aid model that, as we saw in that Equatorial Guinea case, very, very easily lends itself to engagement with corrupt governments. And then the fifth and final, we have to have accountability and transparency. We need effectiveness and impact, and we need to be able to show that. And our aid investments should be accountable both to the taxpayers who finance them and to the client communities that we are trying to serve and support. And we should be able to be accountable for demonstrating results to both. And doing so, in turn, will serve our interests. And I would see four core areas where that serves our interests. The first is around managing transnational challenges, things like pandemic outbreaks, um, things like economic instability, social instability, disorderly migration, climate change. These are transnational challenges that require aid as a part of the solution. We also have a strong interest in upholding global norms. The norms around democracy, open economies, anti-corruption, human rights, the lawful conduct of war. When we advance these consistently and sincerely, that also serves America's global interest. It makes the world safer and more prosperous for us as well. And that, Kennedy himself realized that when he launched USAID. Stability and security are also really important. Over the years, there are some really big wins. There are some pretty tricky stories and some problems that I talked about earlier, but also some big wins from the Marshall Plan to stabilization in the post-war Balkans to supporting Ukraine over the last few years, where U.S. aid, U.S. assistance plays a critical role in stability and security. And finally, by doing this and by lifting up economies and creating economic opportunity overseas, we also advance our own economic prosperity and cultivate trading partners and markets for our own economy. So to do that, I firmly believe, to do all that effectively, I do firmly believe we need a standalone development agency. And it should not be just a rehashed version of USAID. It needs to be reinvented for the modern world, but it will not be achieved if it remains as it is now, a sort of afterthought or backwater responsibility of the U.S. diplomatic service. It needs to be established and organized as its own professional expertise, as its own discipline. And there are many examples over the years of non-diplomatic functions being dissolved in a sort of bureaucratic acid in the State Department. And you can read up on the history of the U.S. Information Agency for one such example of that. But I think if we leave development to that, it will not survive. And so really, to survive, to be effective, to serve American values and American interests, it has to be established as a standalone institution once again. Um, Let me close with a final thought here. I've talked a lot about what USAID should, what USAID did and why U.S. foreign assistance is important in what it does, but I think it's also important in what it represents about America's role in the world. Ultimately, American foreign policy or foreign assistance policy is a reflection of who our country wants to be in the world and of the kind of world we want to build. And for 80 years, the legacy of the post-World War II era was to push the world towards greater collaboration, towards a positive sum world. That philosophy unlocked the greatest period of security and economic prosperity in global history. USAID was founded in recognition that that moral leadership in the world, moral US leadership in the world, could be a positive sum endeavor, and that essentially doing good in the world would also do well by the American people. And I hope at some point in the not too distant future, we get back to that recognition and act accordingly. Sorry for going on at such length. It's a real pleasure. And I think we've got a minute or two for some questions. So let me turn back to Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for just a very impactful, eye-opening presentation, very sobering in terms of some of the statistics that you shared regarding what the impact has really been since the dismantling of USAID, and considering how fast it has all happened, it's a more than just a wake-up call. I think one of the questions, considering we're a university and
Yeah.
we have a lot of students, some of whom who are listening in, if students are considering a career or are motivated, especially now with the difficulties we find ourselves in international development, humanitarian work, or policy related to those, how should they think about entering this field? And what kind of skills, experiences should they go after?
Yes. It is a tricky thing right now. And I teach as an adjunct at Georgetown. And so I talk with my own students about this too. Uh, there are still some opportunities. There are some programs through the UN and through NGOs that are still hiring for overseas positions, but it is a sparse field right now. What I really encourage people to do is look at ways to build the kind of skills that they need, whether or not that's in the international development space in the next few years. So look at other venues where you can build program management experience. Look at other forms of nonprofit management, maybe more domestic programming than international programming. Look at state level disaster response opportunities. FEMA is badly damaged, but most states still have a natural disaster management authority of some kind. Um, and they are often hiring, especially people early in their careers. Those can be great places to learn the basics of crisis response and disaster response. And a lot of the systems we had when I was at USAID were actually built on the same architecture that states use to respond to natural disasters domestically. So there are definitely still opportunities out there. And think in terms of the skills you want to build, not necessarily doing that specifically in an international setting.
Yeah, very, very good advice. Um, it- in some ways related to that, another audience member asked that in the interim, since we don't have right now a federal development organization coming back online in the next couple of years, how do you think that the many global multinational organizations can come together more quickly and easily? And they commented that in addition to the funding that USAID brought, the role they
Yeah,
played as a connector
yeah,
on site, and the, as you mentioned in your talk, the holes that are left when it suddenly just pulled out. Again, not
yeah,
just the money, but all the
yeah.
connections and coordination. How can we do something about that?
I, I'm 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 hopeful, I'm guardedly hopeful that some of that architecture will survive. One of the interesting pivots we've seen from the State Department, which I didn't have time to touch on in the speech, was they still have to spend humanitarian response money. Congress has mandated that. They don't want to do it through NGOs. They don't want to do it through the traditional UN agencies. Anything that sort of looks like the old USAID model, they're trying to avoid. And so what they're doing is putting it into these very flexible pooled funds that are led by UN OCHA and pouring billions of dollars into these funds. I'm a fan of these funds. I'm not sure I would use them in quite this way, but look, it's better than not spending the money at all for sure. And that will, I hope, help to keep some of the fundamentals of the system afloat. Um, and fill some of the it's nowhere close to filling the gaps that have been created by what is being lost, but it at least enables preservation of some of it, I hope.
Okay. So, what can the ordinary citizens, our community members who are tuned in today, what can citizens do to advocate for the type of a organization that you recommend? Is there a role for Congress in this, given the changing governments and ideologies?
Yeah, I think that so we're thinking about this at Refugees International. We're thinking about this in a few ways. First, over the next few years, we need to make the best of the system as it now exists. And so that means putting, calling on Congress to continue to appropriate healthy foreign aid budgets, and then putting pressure on the administration to spend that money, to spend and hopefully spend it as responsibly as possible. Um, they're not going to spend it in the way that I might ideally like, but I still want to see it go out the door. I want to see it helping people in some way. And so putting pressure on Congress and in turn to appropriate the money, and then pressuring the administration to spend it is really important. And more generally, I think some of the destruction we saw last year came out of a perception that at the end of the day, the American people don't really care about this. And I think that's wrong. Certainly, polling shows that there's actually very broad support for many of the core areas of foreign aid, but there is kind of a disconnected political perception in DC that people don't care. Now, if you look at the amount that Americans give to charitable causes overseas, it's clear that Americans do care about it. But I think translating that into more of a political signal that gets heard in Washington is going to be important to all of the above and to laying the groundwork for hopefully building back something in the future.
Yeah, and I guess that will lead me into my last question here, since we're about out of time. So, what is needed for us to move toward this new vision?
Yeah.
And what is the role of non-governmental organizations, such as the one that you represent, Refugees International? What is the role in helping to shape that vision so it's something that all Americans can get behind?
I think it comes down in part to movement building. We need to reinvigorate a movement of Americans who care about this. And I do, as I said, I think Americans generally do care about this. But a lot of the nonprofit sector over many years got very comfortable and very accustomed to the idea that that money was always just going to be there, that the American government would support this, that it had bipartisan support, which it did for many, many years until it suddenly didn't. And so I think we need to get back to a vision of civil society, a vision of international NGOs in the United States as not just service delivery providers who, work with taxpayer funding, but also of a movement of civil society actors who are advancing that solidarity and reflecting the solidarity that many Americans do feel with the rest of the world, and translating that into a political signal um, that shows there is a constituency for doing good in the world and getting back to that vision that Kennedy first laid out in the early 60s.
Thank you. And Jeremy, thank you so much for your presentation today. It really has been quite a lot of food for thought, a veritable feast of food for thought. If you were here in person, you would hear us all clapping for you. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. And for our participants, thank you for attending. And also remember, you will get a pop-up right away about completing some feedback, and we would appreciate it if you do that. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. We have another session coming up at 1:30. And Jeremy, thank you again.
Thanks so much.